Thank you for tuning in to Facebook Live to hear my story. My name is Steen Metz, and I'm a Holocaust survivor. Today, I'm going to share with you my experiences over an 18-month span in a camp in Theresienstadt in Czechoslovakia. But before I get started, it's very, very important, and more important than ever before, that we never forget the Holocaust. I'm sure many of you know about the increase in anti-Semitism, vandalism of Jewish property. It's a very sad, it's a very disturbing time indeed. So there's more reason than ever before to remember the Holocaust. It's an event that has been documented thoroughly, and it's an event that we should never forget. It's very, very disturbing to me, some recent results from a US-wide study among young people between the ages of 18 and 40. It was done nationwide. And here are some numbers I like to relate to you so you get a feel for what I call disturbing results. 11% of the young people, or more than 1 in 10, think that the Holocaust was caused by Jewish people. Can you imagine that? It certainly tells you, it tells the world that we need more education. 49%, or about half the people in the survey, know about Holocaust denial from social media or elsewhere on the internet. 90%, only 90% believe that the Holocaust happened. In other words, 10% do not know that it happened. What a sad story. And finally, one more number, 50%, 52% could not name a single concentration camp. This is why, whenever possible, I want to reach as many people as I can and relate my story to them. I've reached about 85,000 people, including students and other institutions where I have talked. And every time I speak to an audience like this morning, I want to make sure that each person in the group relate my story to at least 4 people. Talk to 4 people, family, friends, students, especially young people, I would like to emphasize. Tell them you know that the Holocaust took place. You listen to a Holocaust survivor, and when you listen to a survivor, you become an eyewitness yourself. If I may have the first slide. This slide I'm showing now is a book which was published originally in 2011. It was updated about a year ago, including questions from students that I talked to, some of the better questions, so to speak. It's titled A Danish Boy in Theresienstadt. Excuse me. Theresienstadt was the camp I was in. Theresienstadt is the German version. Terezin would be the Czech version. And as I speak to you, I'll be using both towns interchangeably. Reflections of a Holocaust survivor. There was only one reason, excuse me, there was only one reason why I wrote the book. I wanted to make sure that future generations, especially the new young people, would never forget that the Holocaust took place. If I may have the next slide. As far as Denmark is concerned, the Holocaust started in April 9th, 1940. It's a long, long time ago. I was 5 years old, at the time. I still remember it quite clearly. The map you're looking at is of Denmark. Maybe some of you have actually been to Denmark and you may recognize the town you visited. The town that I was born and raised in is Odense. You may call it Odense. It's right in the middle of the country with a red frame around it. April the 9th was a very sad day in Denmark's history. That was the day Hitler, that evil man, excuse me, invaded Denmark by land, by air, and by sea. You can see on the map that Denmark is surrounded by water, ocean everywhere. And it was totally unexpected. Denmark had signed a non-aggression pact with Germany, with Hitler. Found out very early on that you could not trust the man. He had signed non-aggression pacts with many other countries. It didn't mean a thing. It wasn't worth the paper it was written on. And he invaded over 20 countries in Europe, including Russia, even though he had signed a non-aggression pact with all of them. I remember seeing planes flying. I remember we got flyers that were sent down from the Germans telling the Danish people to take it easy. Actually, the Germans were there to help us. They were there to protect us from the British people, which of course was a big joke. Britain was our greatest ally. The war, the battle was very brief, probably lasted less than 24 hours. Denmark had to surrender. There was no way they were prepared military-wise to compete against the big war machine from Germany. And I'm not going to take sides whether it was a good or bad thing that Denmark surrendered so easily, but I will say it probably saved thousands of lives. When I look back, the first 3.5 years were almost normal. And I want to emphasize the word almost. The Germans wanted a peaceful occupation. That was their phrase. They didn't want to devote any more resources or manpower to Denmark than they had to. They were busy on many different fronts, especially Russia. What was very unique about Denmark, and this was not the case in just about every other occupied country, the king continued to rule, the Danish government continued to govern. They had to cooperate with the Germans to a great extent. As an example, they could not employ any Jewish people. On the next picture, one of my favorite pictures, because it tells the story. King Christian X, as I mentioned earlier, continued to rule, and he wanted to support the Jewish people, and he was a big supporter of the Jewish people, and he would be riding his horse every morning, all by himself, no bodyguard, and I believe he was close to 70 years old at the time, and he would do it every day. And what I especially like about this picture taken in 1940, 2 German soldiers saluting the king. The king looks straight forward. He doesn't want to have anything to do with the German people. He hated them. He hated the Nazis. And it really hurt him that Denmark was occupied by the Germans for a total of 5 long, long years. As I mentioned, the government was able to govern also, and also this was very, very unusual. They had to cooperate to a certain extent, but the government was still in power, so to speak. Some directions came from the Germans. They controlled the newspaper press, as an example. So an illegal news press emerged which was printed in basements and small offices and so on, with the real truth about the occupation. On the next picture, you can see I haven't changed very much since that picture was taken in the summer of 1943. But there's a much deeper reason why I want to share this picture with you. When I look back, I cannot imagine how my family, meaning my father, my mother, and myself, that we were able to go on vacation. We were gone for about a week, away from my hometown, away from the apartment we lived in, and we had a good time. And it's hard to imagine that while the German soldiers were occupying Denmark, and they were practically on every street corner, we were able to enjoy our vacation. Even though I was very young, I was well aware of the occupation. I would bicycle to work, to school in town every day, back and forth. And I remember I would always try to avoid the German soldiers. They didn't touch me. They didn't threaten me, but you never know. They look very, very intimidating with their weapons. Those relatively normal times stopped, came to a sudden halt in the fall of 1943. If we can just go back to the map, if we can. Thank you. What happened to change it? Young people, high schoolers, students, students from university and colleges were very upset that the Danish government had surrendered so easily. Consequently, they formed groups, nothing to do with the Danish government, groups in every single town, major town in Denmark, including my hometown, Odense, a very well-known group, the Churchill Group, was formed in Odense. Little by little, they were able to sabotage what the Germans were doing. They got from our neighbor east, Sweden. They got weapons from the British people. They would parachute weapons down at night. They would also make bombs. And their major goal was to prevent export of products, especially food products, from Denmark to Germany. One of the major reasons that the Germans wanted, as I referred to earlier, as a peaceful occupation, they wanted to make sure that the Danish factories would make products for Germany, ship it down to Germany, especially food products. It's kind of ironic, while we were rationed, we shipped food products to Germany and we fed the German troops. Little by little, the young people, the saboteurs, resistance movement made it very difficult for the Germans to continue to ship products down to Germany. They also shipped iron from Sweden. And one of the reasons Sweden was able to remain neutral during the Second World War was the fact that Germany needed the iron that came from Sweden. It was shipped via Denmark into Germany. But the resistance movement started to bomb rail cars, factories that made products for the Germans. They made life so miserable for the Germans, which is amazing that they were able to do that. They were very, very courageous. And as far as I'm concerned, I call them upstanders. They were standing up for what they thought were right at a great deal of risk. They had courage. Many of them lost their lives as a result of the resistance movement. It went so well that the German commandant in Denmark had to go to the Danish Prime Minister, request, I shouldn't use the word request, order the Danish government to arrest the saboteurs and sentenced them to death. There was no way the Danish government would agree to do that. As a result, they resigned. The Germans took over. The Danish administration was put in place. And that became the beginning of what we refer to as the final solution, the roundup of the Danish Jews. Once again, it was very different in Denmark than other countries. A German diplomat heard word about the upcoming arrest of the Jewish people. We're now talking about late September, early October 1943. He leaked the word to the Danish administration. They relayed the message to the Jewish congregation in Copenhagen. There was only one synagogue, as I remember it, in Denmark at that time. It was located in Copenhagen, the capital of Denmark. At that time, with a population of 4.5 million, we only had about 8,000 Jewish people, and most of them lived in the area around Copenhagen. As a result, during late September, early October, 7,000 Danish Jews managed to escape to Sweden. Again, Sweden was a neutral country. Most of the people were in fishing boats between the eastern part of Denmark and the western part of Sweden. You can see Sweden with the cream color. And at the narrowest point between the two countries was about 1.5 miles. Many families, especially in the area around Copenhagen, were upstanders. Again, they stood up for what they thought were right, and they were hiding Jewish families, friends, non-friends, so to speak, in their homes. They were hiding in hospitals on the loft. As a matter of fact, a cousin of mine was hiding in a loft just north of Copenhagen. Many Jewish families were hiding in the hospital under false names. It's a very unique situation. And 95% of the total Danish Jewish population managed to escape to Sweden. This was unheard of in any other country in Europe. Unfortunately, living in the middle of the country, and to my knowledge, we had not been warned. You have to remember that communications were so different in those days. And when I talk to students, I always have to remind them, we didn't even have TV, and we certainly didn't have smartphones. I'm not so sure if it had happened much later, with more modern technology, that we wouldn't have been warned. But to my knowledge, we had not been warned, and there was quite a distance between Copenhagen and my hometown. There were very few Jewish families in my hometown. There were several families outside of my hometown, and there were a number of young German people that had immigrated, escaped from Germany, and worked on farms in Denmark. As a result, one early morning, it was Rosh Hashanah, it was October 2nd, 1943. I was 8 years old. I remember it quite clearly. German Gestapo pounded on our door. We lived on the second floor in an apartment, third floor, I should say. I had no idea what was going on. As I mentioned earlier, I knew about the occupation. But why were the German soldiers in our home? Why didn't they go to our neighbors? Why didn't they go across the street? At that time, I did not know I was Jewish. we did not practice the Jewish faith. Both my parents were Jewish. My mother did not practice the Jewish faith when she was young. My father, they both came from Copenhagen, did practice the Jewish faith while living in Copenhagen, but to my knowledge, not while he was in Odense. And as I mentioned to students, is it a crime to be Jewish? Is it a crime to be a Catholic? Of course not. But the evil mind of Hitler it was. And there's only one reason why 6 million Jewish people and millions of others lost their lives. They happened to be born Jewish. If we can just move forward with some slides. Next one, please. Next one. Perfect. We got about 40 minutes to get ready. My mother and I were allowed to go and visit the bakery on the street, on the first floor. We got some bread. We got some rolls from the baker. We knew the baker. I played with his children. Later on, I heard from my mother that the baker offered to hide my mother and I down in the basement. And we might have been, there was a corridor downstairs. And theoretically, we might have been able to escape and eventually go to Sweden. But there was no way my mother could allow that, would agree to it. My father, who was back in the apartment, would have been shot on the spot. This is a very unique picture you're looking at. It's considered an artifact. To my knowledge, it's the only picture taken of a Jewish people being arrested from a schoolyard in the center of town in Odense. About 60 people standing in the schoolyard. I've looked at it so many times with magnifying glass. I tried to see if I could find my mother, my father, and myself, but that wasn't possible. We spent a couple of hours there, and in the next slide, you'll see what happened next. For those of you that have visited the museum, you'll remember seeing a cattle car like the one in the picture. Those of you who have not visited the museum yet, I encourage you to visit it. Has a lot of history, has a lot of documentation, a lot of artifacts. Can you imagine spending more than 80 hours in a cattle car, completely enclosed, no windows, no doors? It was dark, it was uncertain. What was going to happen? I still remember looking at the faces of people, they looked frightened. Can you imagine how the 8-year-old felt? I didn't understand exactly what happened. My parents tried to explain it to me. Excuse me. But I still couldn't understand why my cousins weren't there, why some of my neighbors weren't there. We got nothing to eat, nothing to drink. As I mentioned, it was complete dark. No blankets, no chairs, no couches, and I can go on and on. We shared the bakery products we got from the baker in Odense. Other people have brought snacks and sandwiches, and we would share that. The Germans did not feed us in over 80 hours. I guess they couldn't care less. And we were from the beginning, we were not treated as human beings. And maybe the reason being that they didn't consider the Jewish people as being humans. The atmosphere was very, very tense in the cattle car. We were literally packed like sardines. I believe there were 3 or 4 children about my age, and we were able to lie down. The rest of the people, during a span of 80 hours, alternated between sitting and standing. The smell was getting worse and worse. There were no bathroom facilities. We had to use buckets in the corner. We made one stop, got out, got some fresh air. Later on, I heard that in another cattle car, not ours, a Danish old lady committed suicide, had some poison pills. She would rather commit suicide than being taken to a German concentration camp. I believe in total, there were about 8 or 10 Jewish people that committed suicide, and another 5 or 7 drowned on their way over to Sweden. Eventually, if I may have the next slide, we ended up in Tersen. You can see on the slide, Tersen is located in was then Czechoslovakia. Today it's the Czech Republic. It's about 550 miles from my hometown. On the next picture, on the next slide, you can see the train station on the left and Jewish people walking from the train station into the camp. At that time, there was no train station in the camp. We had to walk for about a mile and a half. As soon as we arrived at the camp, we were ordered to empty our pockets. They took all our valuables, money, jewelry, fountain pens. Maybe the younger generation don't remember what a fountain pen looked like. They went through our luggage, took everything valuable. I still remember, or maybe my father told me about it. They suggested that we bring money because we were able to spend it. What a way of spending money, going right back to Germans to use it for funding of the war. When we arrived in the camp, we were separated into men, women, children, and seniors. You were a senior if you were 65 years or older. You were a child if you were 14 years or younger. Just about all the children slept in dormitories. I still don't understand how my mother was able to persuade the German authorities that I could stay with her. But I stayed with her the entire 18 months in camp. I was 8 years old. Normally, I would have been with children in the dormitory. My mother was a very strong, a very tenacious person. So that might be how she was able to persuade the German authorities that I could stay with her. I want to emphasize this was very unique. I have met other children that stayed with their mother, but never met anybody who stayed with their father. On the next slide, you'll see the conditions away from home in the concentration camp. It's hard to imagine that we spent 18 months in the camp, 18 months on a loft, similar to what you see here. We slept on bunk beds. It's very warm in the summer. It was very cold in the winter. I would be scratching myself during the night. I never heard of lice. I never heard of fleas. My mother tried to explain it to her 8-year-old boy, but it was hard to understand. You see, we had very few clothes with us. I think my mother had a suitcase, and I believe my father had another suitcase, but we had very little belongings, and all the good stuff had been taken by the Germans. Anybody 15 years or older had to work. slave labor. That included my father and my mother. My father was an attorney, and he was used to office work. He was used to litigating in the courtyard, in a court. Suddenly, he had to perform slave labor. It was very hard for him because he was exposed to hard road work. It was cold. The winter was starting. They didn't provide any uniforms. My father was wearing an overcoat to keep warm. From a younger person in his work group, we heard later on that my father was physically abused and whipped several times when he didn't produce enough. A young Nazi soldier came up to my father and literally tore the winter coat off his shoulders and said, "You don't work with a winter coat." Easy to say when they didn't provide any uniforms. Got very little to eat, and I'll cover that in a few minutes. My father lost 50% of his body weight. He couldn't handle it. He ended up in the infirmary and had very, very great professionals, doctors, nurses from many different countries. They tried to save my father, but they didn't have the tools. They didn't have the medical supplies. And my father didn't get enough nourishment. He didn't get enough food. After spending 2 to 3 months in the infirmary, he passed away at the young age of 40. Having been married to my mother for less than 10 years, he died clearly of hunger, malnutrition. There was no way the Germans were going to tell the rest of the world that he died of hunger. On the death certificate, they listed it as pneumonia. My mother, to my knowledge, was not physically abused, but she was what I refer to mentally abused on a number of occasions. At one time, and she had many different jobs, and they all had long hours, weekends, Jewish holidays, Christian holidays, maybe at least 8 to 10 hours work a day. And one of her jobs were to clean floors in a factory. It was a big floor, and she told me about it later on. And she had just finished. She was very tired, and she was ready to go back to her barrack. And a German Nazi officer came in, looked at the floor, which was shiny clear, clean, according to my mother. And suddenly the Nazi officer saw a bucket with dirty water. He literally kicked the bucket, and the water flowed all over the floor. It was all the dirty water my mother had cleaned the floor earlier. Now she had to do it all over again. Was very upset. Not much you can do. And she came back and told me the story. And today, I still don't understand how one human being can treat another human being in that manner. Being 8 years old, I didn't have to work. My mother thought it would be good to do some voluntary work. Not much you can do at that age, 8, 9 years old. I became a gopher, a messenger, taking German documents, messages from one Nazi office to the other. And I would do that a couple hours in the morning, a couple hours in the afternoon. I still remember how I would rush out of the respective offices. The soldiers looked intimidating. They never touched me. They never threatened me. They never talked to me, never approached me, but you never know what could happen. On my way back to the barrack from working in the afternoon, I would pass the kitchen and I would see some big sacks of raw potatoes. I would look around to make sure nobody was watching, and I would then help myself in putting a raw potato in each pocket to share with my mother. Yes, I was stealing, technically, but we needed all the help we could get. And I still remember when my mother and I were liberated, she was afraid that stealing, like I stole potato, would be an everyday nature for me. And she was actually afraid that I would turn into a kleptomaniac. But fortunately, that didn't happen. But I was very, very careful, and I cannot imagine what the consequences would have been if they had caught me. As I said, we needed all the help we could get, because at breakfast, all we got was substitute coffee, about half a loaf of bread for the family, with a little margarine. The bread had to last the rest of the week. On the next slide, you will see how we lined up for lunch. I call it the soup kitchen. And you can see some old people with their canes. We had our wooden bowl. We had our bowl and a wooden spoon, and we would stand for, it seemed ages, maybe it was 40 minutes to get soup. When I say soup, every day at lunch, we got the same, what they refer to as potato soup. It was boiled water with potato peel. The mass, the heart of the potato, I don't know who got it, maybe the guards ate it. The first few days I couldn't eat the soup. My mother said, Steen, you have to eat it or you're not going to make it. That was all the encouragement I needed. At dinner, we would line up once again. At dinner, we would get different kinds of soups. I remember barley soups quite often, but there was a variety of soups we got. But once a week, we got a German pasta dish, dumplings, which was a special treat. How were we able to survive on those meager portions? Not only very limited food, but there was very little nourishment in the food. I remember standing in line for the potato soup as an example. We would try to get the bottom of the soup so at least we could get some of the potato skin, which had some nutritious value. I believe the only reason I'm able to talk to you today, and first of all, it's very fortunate because there were 15,000 children that passed through to Theresienstadt, and about 1,200 or less than 10%, we survived. I was very, very lucky. I'll never forget a very deep question I got from an 8th grade student a few years ago. He asked me, do you feel guilty or lucky being alive today? Maybe I should feel guilty, but I first of all feel very, very lucky. And I believe the reason that I survived is the fact that we started getting packages after 6 months. Unfortunately, too late to save my father. And the packages came from friends in Denmark, non-Jewish friends, families, Jewish families in Sweden. It was arranged by the Red Cross. And the packages consisted of food, clothing, and vitamins. This was very, very unique. And people are always surprised when I tell them about it. But all nations in Theresienstadt, we were able to get packages. I believe the Danes got more packages than any other nation because of tremendous support among our non-Jewish friends in Denmark and our family in Sweden. There was very little anti-Semitism in Denmark, and certainly compared to countries like Poland, it was very, very limited. So one day, my mother is opening a package, and she can't understand why it's so heavy. And as she digs into the package, can't find any food, no vitamins, no clothing. At the bottom of the package, she finds a brick, a heavy brick. And that's why the package was so heavy. Those cruel, cruel guards had substituted all the good stuff with the brick. How can anybody get satisfaction from that? I still get the chills when I tell you the story. Obviously, my mother was very, very upset, but there's very little you can do. I want to relate one other experience from camp. I was a growing boy, needed new shoes. I'd outgrown the old pair. No shoe stores, no department stores. How was my mother able to get shoes? She bartered, and I'm sure she was good at it. She bartered with a Czech lady, and the Czech lady got some salami and Danish butter and cheese. And in turn, my mother got some used shoes that I was able to wear the rest of my time in camp. I learned later on that food was like gold, and if you had food, you could get just about anything in camp. I'm often asked, what did I do in camp other than work in the morning, afternoon, lining up for food? I would play with other children. I was especially friendly with some Czech boys, and we were able to play soccer. We didn't have a real soccer field. We had a gravel field. We had phantom goalposts, and we had a soccer ball made up of clothes, racks that the mothers tied together, and we were able to kick it around. That was probably the only time I truly felt like a boy should feel. I didn't feel I was in prison. I almost felt free, and we had a wonderful time together. Until one day the children didn't show up, and I had no idea what happened. I talked to my mother, and she said, "Don't worry, they'll probably be back in a couple of days. They may not have felt like playing soccer." Little did I know, on the next picture, please, those poor children were deported to extermination camps like Auschwitz-Birkenau. 85,000 people, prisoners from Theresienstadt, ended up in an extermination camp. Another 35,000 people passed away, most of them dying from hunger and malnutrition. It's hard for me to imagine that I didn't know about those transports. My mother didn't think it was necessary for me to know about it. There were apparently terrible scenes. The husbands wanted to join their wives and vice versa. They wanted to leave the children behind because they had a greater chance for survival. I went back to Theresienstadt in the year 2009. I wanted to see it for myself as a free person. I wanted to do some research because I had started my book. And I'm glad I went. I remember my mother was asked many times, did she ever feel like going back to Theresienstadt? And she said, no, once was more than enough. While in Theresienstadt, I could hear my mother's voice, Steen, why did you want to go back? But on the next slide, you'll see a memorial. And this really brings back history. In the beginning, people were buried in graves. They ran out of land. They built the crematorium, they cremated the bodies. They wanted to eliminate any trace of the cardboard urns, so to speak. They ordered children like myself, and I was 9 years old at the time, to form a human chain from the crematorium all the way over. And in the background, you can barely see the River Elbe. And those cardboard boxes passed from one person to the other, and eventually they ended up in the river, a total of 25,000. On the next slide, you'll see an illustration of the way Theresienstadt looked at one day only, and that was June 23rd, 1944. At that time, Danish administration wanted to see how the Jewish people were treated in Theresienstadt. Eventually, the German gave them permission to visit with a representative Red Cross from Denmark, Germany, and Switzerland. It was used as propaganda by the Nazis. It was a big hoax. The buildings were suddenly painted. There were fake storefronts with products in them. In the back, there were sinks that didn't work. They were just for show. There was no plumbing. There were music pavilion or people performing, benches, grass. I can go on and on. It did not look like Theresienstadt at all. The delegation arrived. They spent about 46 hours, including lunch, in the camp. They were constantly accompanied by a Gestapo officer, and they decided what they should see and what they shouldn't see. On top of that, prior to their arrival, about 10,000 very frail people were shipped to extermination camps. Children got extra food. We were able to play in front of the delegation. It was a big, big show. It was well done. The propaganda worked. The delegations went back to relative Denmark, Germany, and Switzerland, and didn't see the real Theresienstadt, the real concentration camp. I want to move on to what I refer to as happier time. And when I finish, I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have. And you may want to submit questions now, or you may want to think about some questions you may have. Happier Time started on April the 15th. At that time, Swedish buses, white buses, Red Cross buses arrived from Sweden. Again, keep in mind, Sweden was neutral. We, the Danish Jews from the camp, Norwegian Jews from other camps, were liberated by the Red Cross. The white buses saved, liberated about 15,000 inmates from many different camps. We boarded the buses. We started getting sandwiches. The adults got cigarettes. And when I talk to students, I always comment. In those days, nobody knew that it wasn't healthy to smoke, and just about everybody smoked. And it was just about impossible to get cigarettes while in camp, unless you were able to barter cigarettes for some food. The drivers from Denmark and Sweden were very courageous. I think the convoy consisted of about 25 buses, medical equipment, and they were very courageous because the war was still going on. The Soviets, the Russians coming from the east, and the Allies coming from the west. And I remember we had to stop many times because of bombardment. And it's a miracle they were able to drive through Germany and drive back. We arrived in Denmark, and we got on the next slide, and we got a warm, warm welcome. Would you believe that Denmark was occupied at that time? Look at the white buses, look at the people welcoming us back, flowers, sandwiches, chocolates, cigarettes, you name it. As part of the agreement, we could not stay in Denmark. We had to go to Sweden, which was a neutral country, and we were in quarantine for the first 7 days. They wanted to make sure that we didn't bring any illnesses like typhus into the country. Some weeks later, we reconnected with our family from Copenhagen. All other family members, except my father, survived. This is very unusual. If you heard survivors before, in most cases, most of their families passed away. But again, this was different in Denmark. Some weeks later, Germany finally surrendered on May the 5th, 1945. On the next picture, you'll see the Danish flag, and it was flying everywhere. Denmark was celebrating as never before. May the 5th also happens to be my birthday. And when I went to school in Denmark, they would celebrate and they would raise the flags, and I believe they still do that. I would always tell my friends and anybody who would listen, do you know why they're flying the flag today? They're celebrating my birthday. As a matter of fact, on May the 5th, 1945, I was 10 years old. We managed at the end of May or maybe early June to return to Denmark. We were not able to return to our apartment that had been rented out. There had always been scarce, the apartment in Denmark. As far as our personal belongings, we had most of it. It was stored by the company where my father worked, the legal company. We had nowhere to stay. We stayed with some friends. I got some lessons from a nice school teacher, private lesson. Later on, I was able to return to my original class, even though I'd not been able to go to 4th grade or most of 3rd grade. I managed to catch up somehow, went to 5th grade right away. I think it was very helpful for me to reconnect with my old school friends. If I'd gone to another class with children or friends I didn't know, I think I may have taken longer to get used to the daily life in Denmark. Some years later, I graduated from high school and later on from commercial college. My mother had to go back to work. This may not sound unusual today, but in those days it was. Today, most housewives work. At that time, very few housewives worked. After graduating, I had a couple of temporary jobs, and then I joined a big food company that did most of their business abroad. When you live in a small country like Denmark, about the size of Rhode Island, you want to see the world. And initially, I worked in Denmark, special training, then England, then Canada. I met my wife there, Eileen. She was from England. We got married in Toronto. Then eventually we were transferred to the United States. And I've been here since 1962. And I work for other food companies like Kraft and Sara Lee and some others. And I've always been in the food business. And maybe subconsciously, I wanted to make sure that I would always have food to eat. I can go on and on. I will just finish my talk with my, if I may have the next slide. This is my website, steenmetzneverforget.com. If anybody is interested in more information, please go to my website. And rather than me talking, I always love questions, and I'm looking forward to answering your question. And I really appreciate you coming today to hear my story. And I'm so glad. Can you imagine if we didn't have Zoom, what would we do? So I'm ready for any questions you may have.
Thank you so much. We do have a couple questions. Let's see. The first one. In your opinion, what parts of the museum should people visit and why?
I think they should visit the whole museum. I have difficulties determining which part they should not see. It's just wonderful history. It's well documented. And I especially want to make sure that people see the cattle car, because that tells a big story. And as I mentioned earlier, that was just a terrible time. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's see. How did you cope with what was happening at such a young age?
Another good question. I think I was very lucky I was that young. I think it's easier to cope at that age. I think it was more difficult for my mother. She suffered, her nerves suffered, her hearing suffered. There was a heavy bombardment, very loud, close to the camp. And she lost her hearing for a total of 8 days. How she was able to cope after her husband, my father, passed away as a single parent, I'll never understand. But as I mentioned, she was very strong, very tenacious. And I remember a number of people asked her, how were you able to sustain? How were you able to spend time? And how were you able to survive? And she mentioned, you just had to believe and you couldn't give up. And the best thing is not to give up. And there were other people that gave up and they couldn't, they didn't make it. That was kind of a long way of answering your question.
No, but it was a good answer, you know. Why do you think there was so little anti-Semitism in Denmark, and why was Sweden willing to accept so many Jews from Denmark?
The first question, why was there so little anti-Semitism in Denmark? I think it was the culture. I don't want to mislead anybody. There was anti-Semitism, but not nearly to the extent of like Czechoslovakia and of course Germany and Poland. I think it was the culture. But first of all, the Jewish people were integrated into the population. And in Denmark, you were first of all Danish. Didn't really matter whether you were Jewish or whether you were Catholic or Lutheran. You were first of all considered Danish. And I remember when my mother was interviewed the year before she passed away, she was asked whether she considered or was treated as a Jewish person. And she said, first of all, I was Danish. Of course, I was Jewish, but first of all, I was Danish. So I think it's all in the culture. And over years, Denmark had accepted Jewish people from many countries. There are a lot of Russian, former Russian and Poland living in Denmark today, Jewish people.
Okay. Do you remember when Nazis tried to march in Skokie?
I do remember it. At that time, I lived on the North Shore. At that time, I hadn't written my book. I hadn't started talking about it. And typically, most Holocaust survivors do not talk very much about it. My mother and I didn't talk a great deal about it. She wanted to look forward and not back. You never forget it. And it was, I couldn't believe when the neo-Nazis marched and I would be watching it on TV. I didn't go to Skokie, and as you know, the march, they managed not to get into Skokie, but there were a lot, the reason they marched on Skokie, which you may not be aware of, there were more Jewish survivors in Skokie than any other area in the Chicago area, maybe anywhere else in United States. And the reason, because of that march, that's the reason the museum was located in Skokie. And the second question was, how does Sweden remain neutral? Was that the second question?
Yes.
Sweden, in the beginning, as I understand it, people didn't quite know whether they were going to be with the Allies or the Germans. But they were able to remain neutral because I think I might have mentioned that the Germany imported iron from Sweden. This was used in their steel industry, and it wasn't a given that they would accept the Danish Jews. But I have a great deal of respect and admiration for the Swedes. They took in about 15,000 Danish. Half of them were Jewish people. The other half were people that were fighting in the underground movement and other police and so on. So I have a great deal of respect for, and it's kind of ironic. Years ago, Denmark and Sweden would be fighting, and now they allowed people into the country. I think that was just great.
Good. Let's see. How did you and your mother cope with what your family had gone through, and did she ever talk about it?
I think I talked earlier about coping, but did she ever talk about it? Very, very little. I remember when people would be asking us, she would always say, ask her, not me. She wanted me to forget it, put it in the background. You can't do that. But you don't forget it. But it's typical. There's still survivors. They don't talk about it. And I'm not saying they're right or that now I talk about I'm right. It's very ironic. For years, I talked very little to my mother about it. Based on that tradition, I talked very little to my two daughters about it growing up on the North Shore of Chicago. Then now I have 4 grandchildren, and they know at that age, they know much more about it than anybody, other people in the family, because I wrote the book, I talked to their schools, and today I cannot talk enough about it. I like to talk to some of my friends, some of my peers at the museum. So it's quite a evolution.
So coming off of that, why did you get involved at the museum?
When I had written my book, I thought that was it. I wasn't going to go any further. Then my daughter, oldest, my grandson, was in 8th grade in Park Ridge. And my daughter talked to the teacher, and they thought it would be a good idea if I would share my experiences with them. I was very, very hesitant because I didn't know how 8th grade boys and girls would behave, whether they would be fiddling with their phone all the time, or would they not behave. They were very, very good. It was a completely different presentation. At that time, I read passages from my book. They asked a number of questions. And afterwards, I talked to my daughter, and she and the teacher thought it went well. My grandson, who at that time was quite introvert, even asked questions which surprised me. And afterwards, he told me that a friend of his said to him, your grandpa was awesome. And with that kind of comment, it became a career for me, so to speak, a second career, to talk to students and other institutions.
Okay. Another question we've just gotten is, do you think that what people went through during the Holocaust is accurately portrayed in pop culture today?
It's not always rightly publicized. Most of the literature is correct, but it concerns me a great deal that the young people, as I mentioned earlier about the research, that they don't know enough about the Holocaust as far as I'm concerned, and I'm not sure I'm totally objective. but in general, also very concerned about the Holocaust denial because of the social media and the internet. But I believe, generally speaking, the film, the Steven Spielberg film, and the books are accurately projected related to the Holocaust.
So following up with that, how can people watching today help to educate others? What kind of books, talks, movies do you recommend?
What movie I would recommend? The Schindler's List. I would recommend several books. Of course, I would recommend my own book. First of all, I'm not totally objective there. It's available in the Legacy Shop in the museum. I will also recommend Night, which is a very good book used for education. And there seems to be more and more books, and I find more and more books about the occupation in Denmark, which I'm reading at the present time. But first of all, and not because I'm speaking on behalf of the museum, but a visit to the museum, as far as I'm concerned, is the best way of knowing more about the Holocaust. And as I mentioned, I think during my talk, please pass on the word to as many people as possible.
All right, and we have one more question, and it's what message do you want people to take away from hearing your story?
A couple of messages. One message would be never give up. I mentioned earlier how my mother had been asked why she didn't give up. Another message would be try and treat other people the way you want to be treated yourself. It doesn't mean we have to love each other, but we want to be kind. There's too much fighting going on. There's too much politics, bad politics in the world today, even sometimes compared to the Holocaust, which is terrible. But as far as school students are concerned, talk to other people and basically treat other people, as I said, the way you want to be treated yourself. But keep in mind the opposite would be the way the Nazis treated the Jewish people. And it's very sad. Since then, we had several genocides, the most recent one in Syria. Does that answer the question?
Yes, it does. That is all the questions we have right now. Thank you so much. I'm going to let you say goodbye to everybody.
I want to thank you again for tuning in. I'd like to ask you to join us next Wednesday, October 21st at 10 a.m. to hear Holocaust survivor George Brent share his history of survival, just like I did today. Please keep an eye on Illinois Holocaust Museum's Facebook and other social media accounts, where we'll post a stream of content through the weeks ahead. Thank you for your support during these extraordinary times. Stay healthy, stay safe, and thank you again for tuning in to my talk today. Thank you very much. And also for the great questions.